Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, A Guide to Interpersonal Communication and Conflict for Autistic Teens and Adults. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. To the right of your screen is the control panel. As an attendee, you have the option of listening in using your computer or by phone. To switch from computer audio to phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and follow the dial-in instructions. If you're having trouble hearing me, please send a message through the questions pane and we will assist you. For today's session, we've shared some materials in the handouts pane, and you can download these materials at any time. At the end of today's event, you will receive a certificate of attendance via email. Since your mic is muted by default, you can submit questions to our presenters by typing them into the questions pane at any time, and we will hold off answering any questions until the end of the presentation. And now, since most of you are now here, let's go ahead and get started. To those of you who have just joined us, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, A Guide to Interpersonal Communication and Conflict for Autistic Teens and Adults. My name is Clara and I'm your host today for today's event. It's great to have you all here with us today. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speakers, Dr. Courtney Lang and Liana Hicks. Dr. Courtney Lang is a corporate education consultant and owner of CB Media. She spent nearly 2 decades teaching communication and research analytics at the university level. At her last position of service, she worked closely with the Autism Initiative at Mercyhurst, also known as AIM. During her time there, she taught in the CREATE program and worked closely with AIM to improve communication interactions and outcomes for autistic and neurodiverse students. Liana Hicks is a student support coordinator in the Autism Initiative at Mercyhurst University with 4 years of experience within the department. She is integral in assisting with the CREATE program development and increasing AIM's external network of local and global partnerships. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Courtney. Go ahead, Courtney.
Hello, everyone. I apologize that it's a little loud where I am. I'm actually on my way to Atlanta and I'm in the airport in Cleveland right now. So shout out to anyone from Cleveland or Atlanta. Those are my 2 locations today. We're gonna start with 2 questions in the survey, I believe, Clara, is that correct? Yeah,
yes, we're going to do a couple of polls here. So let me go ahead and launch them. Our first poll is, have you had a major conflict in a relationship that went unresolved? So go ahead and select your option. Is it a yes or a no for you? It looks a bit like about half of you have responded so far. So those of you who have not yet responded, please go ahead and submit your responses now, and we will close the poll in a moment. All right, so we're now going to close the poll and I'm going to share the results with everyone. Okay, so here are our results. It looks like 82% of you said yes. Courtney, would you like to say anything about these results?
So unfortunately, this happens to a lot of us, right? If anyone's ever heard of the Pareto rule, where things get divided 80-20, the Pareto rule in this case always leans towards yes. Whether you are autistic, another part of neurodiversity, or what we consider neurotypical, relationships can be very difficult, particularly resolving conflict. This one is a little bit atypical in the sense that not everyone has this issue of finding it difficult to start new relationships. And the reason we had this question second is because this is more something that happens in the neurodiversity community. It also can be if someone is considered shy, but as many of you may know, shyness sometimes gets pushed off onto people who don't act in what we consider a typical way. All right, thank you, Clara.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Clara, for some reason my slides aren't advancing when I click on them now, so if you don't mind advancing it for me, thank you. So when we think about interpersonal communications, what we're really talking about are relationships, and it has to do with two people, right? If it is more than two people, we call that intergroup, but we're really going to focus on interpersonal today. Now, you can see here that there's a difference between inter and intra-personal. So if it's that INTRA, that's self-talk. That's the way that we speak to ourselves. That's, sometimes associated with our self-esteem or those internal pep talks that we give to each other. It's important to remember that interpersonal relationships and that type of communication are not limited. They're a continuum. They're ongoing. While a relationship may end, during the span of the relationship, you're moving from one point to another, and you may not reach that end point until the end of that relationship could come in many, many different forms, right? You could be friends with someone for a few months, or you could be friends with them for decades. And so it's important to remember that as that relationship goes forward, it may change, the status may change at different points in time, but there is a continuum in that relationship. And then it's also very important to remember that as you get more personal in a relationship, you become more interdependent. I'm sure that you can think of a time where you had someone, a friend, or someone that was maybe a family member or a romantic partner or non-romantic partner that you had a relationship with where you became very interdependent on one another. You might even take over roles for each other. My spouse and I have a relationship where we say that we equal one human because we divide and conquer things. We try to keep it pretty close to even, but we lean on each other at various times, and that's interdependence. Okay, next slide. Okay. And remember that learning about interpersonal communication is a lifelong project. We get better at it. It changes all the time. In my lifetime, I've seen the cell phone arise. Literally, the first cell phone call was made within my lifetime. Computers moving from something that were used by scientists and NASA being giant to something as small as our phones has happened within my lifetime. And so I learned to communicate one way as a child, and that started to rapidly change as I was in college. And one of the things that's been very fascinating is that while everything is unique, technology adds to that uniqueness, and it changes how those experiences can move forward. It's one of the reasons why we sometimes see intergenerational issues, because we older folks don't necessarily understand how younger folks are communicating with one another. To kind of point this out, I learned a new term about a month ago called phubbing, which is snubbing someone with your phone. So sitting at a table, there's two of you, and you're looking at your phone, and the other person is trying to talk to you directly. That's considered a faux pas. But as we know, when we're neurodiverse, sometimes having our phone or something else in that space might be a comfort, and so it's not meant to be a slight. And so there are lots of ways in which communication can be different, but also each relationship learns its own techniques, right? Again, You know, my spouse is someone who, if he pulls his phone out, I know it's because he's uncomfortable, and I don't consider it a slight. But someone who doesn't know him might consider that a slight. They might think that he is phubbing in that situation, okay? And so we learn these different skills. We learn ways to move forward and to communicate with one another. And as we learn these new skills, we start to understand these various factors. We get to realize that everybody is unique. The way we communicate with each other is different all the time. And therefore, we become more competent in the ways that we interact with each other. Oh, sorry about that. So the ways that this interpersonal communication enhances our lives, makes our lives better, is it has these 4 main functions. Psychological, this is everything from, do you feel happy when you get to talk to people? Do you feel fulfilled by talking to people? I always say that I am an introvert who is also an extrovert, because I can get filled up with experience and then I need to go and be by myself to reset, right? That's part of that psychological function. I get to the point where I'm full. I sort of imagine it like a cup of water, right? I don't want it to run over. And so when I get to this point where I'm very full, I excuse myself. And I try to do it in a way and explain, look, this is about all I have, right? We have a term in our house. I've used all my words for today. It's a way to sort of build that bridge between the psychological and the social. I can't be social anymore, or it's going to impact me on a psychological level. And again, that competency of understanding each other comes into play here. You may communicate with another person in ways that aren't speaking. You may communicate by playing games together, or just being near someone else while doing separate activities, right? You can be social without talking. Social isn't just this back and forth communication. It can also be just being near someone. It can be non-verbal, right? Without using your words, and just taking up space near someone can be enough for us. Interpersonal communication is also information driven, right? You might communicate with someone to get instructions or directions, or you might interact with, say, an educator to learn more about something that you don't understand in a class. Talk to your manager or a coworker about things in your job. Hold meetings, one-on-one sessions. Mentorship falls in between information and influence, right? It's informatic, but it's also influencing people. Apologize, it's getting a little loud in here. Influence is, we can sometimes say political, and that's not always a dirty word, right? Someone who is political knows how to influence people in situations to move things forward. We use the term greasing the wheels. Politics often gets a dirty rap in this area, but you know, office politics can be good or bad. School politics, big country politics always feel rough, but influence is here, right? Are you a charismatic talker? Are you someone that can get things done? And so, you know, all of these sort of work together, but they have different impacts on us based on who we are and how we function. Now, there are many considerations that exist in this space, and diversity in your communication style is a big one. I know I have a few former AIM students, some alums in here who have had experiences with this, and we've spoken directly to one another, especially about diversity and cultural awareness and communication. One of the big things that's different, and I believe we've got a few people from Canada in here today. My family on one side is French Canadian, and they act very differently than my side of the family that's German. And in the United States, we can be very direct. In Japan, that directness is considered impolite, right? And so understanding the influence of culture is extremely important. Making sure that we see that cultural variability, right? Are you a first generation immigrant, or are you an international student? That might impact how you interact with certain things that are said to you. And then making sure that you're culturally aware. We don't want to microaggress against each other because we don't understand cultural competencies. Okay. And then when we're thinking about orientation, there are two specific types of orientation, and those are individual and collective. The United States, we're very individualistic. Other cultures, again, we use Japan as the example again here, much more collective. Canada is fascinating because it's both. It's a yes and sort of culture. There are times where they're very individual about things, but we'll work together as a collective to get things changed. I've done some studies on ways that people, especially in countries that have a lot of unions, but also a lot of civil liberties, can live in both of those spaces. And it impacts how we talk to each other depending on the subject matter. Is it about work? Is it about the price of goods? We're going to think more collectively about those than we're going to think about whether or not we're available on the weekend, where some cultures, all of that is very much collective or all individual. And then high and low context has to do with contextualization, meaning that if you ask me a question here in the US, I may say yes or no. For in Japan, I don't necessarily want to say yes or no. And so especially if it's a no, I may make a gesture while saying maybe, or I may not say anything to you directly. And so high context means that you're looking for interpersonal, nonverbal cues like hand gestures or facial expressions or how someone moves their body will show you those things. Where low context, it's direct, it's this is the answer, right? There's a phrase that gets associated with New Yorkers. I'm walking here, right? That's low context, individualist, right? Being very direct. And while it is something that's kind of stereotypical, it also shows that, you know, if you walk in front of somebody on the sidewalk in New York or you cut someone off in going through the subway turnstile, they're going to say something to you. Whereas in other countries, they may make a gesture or they may make a sound, but they're not necessarily going to confront you in that situation. And I'm going to hand it over to my my colleague, Liana Hicks now. And again, I'm sorry that it's so loud where I am. It's going to be a lot quieter where Liana is. Thank you.
And Liana, we just need you to unmute yourself, please.
And Clara, if you can go back one slide, we missed one.
Sure.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about gender. Gender is a social creation. There are these pressures to conform to norms, scripts, and preferences. For example, a woman dresses femininely. A male dresses in pants and a dress shirt. There are many pressures for us to perform and act a certain way because of that, and those are all creation of our society. Next slide. Social norms can often cause a lot of conflict because a lot of these social norms are made up and created by our society. Some people don't want to follow those social norms and they don't believe in those social norms. So they create a lot of conflict. For example, you should dress a certain way when you go to work. A lot of people are now dressing much more casual and have a different opinion about how they should look at work. And that causes a lot of conflict in the workplace and with people. And our social norms don't always make logical sense. So there's some things we need to think about when we are following these social norms. And an example of something that's not making sense is, you know, in the past, women were always submissive and men were leaders. That doesn't make any sense nowadays. As we know, women can be leaders and women can lead as well. But that is something that didn't make sense, and we followed for a very long time. And we also follow a lot of societal scripts. And what that means is women talk a certain way, men talk a certain way. We follow these things, and that can also lead to conflict. Not everyone wants to follow what society tells them to follow, and this can lead to a lot of conflict. And what I find in my work is that a lot of times there's also a not understanding of social norms. Some social norms are pretty necessary, like present yourself in a neat and clean manner. They're pretty necessary and may not be essential or important to everyone. But in order to be respected and taken seriously, we have to be in a neat and clean manner. And not all of that is important. And I have found in my work with students that, you know, a lot of times people get angry with the students because they didn't understand a societal norm or a social norm. And taking that time to explain that social norm and breaking it down into steps is very helpful with the neurodiverse and neurotypical population. Let's face it, we don't all understand every social norm, and conflict arises greatly. So really breaking it down, I found with working with the students that I worked with, one of the biggest frustrations were these social norms and how they just don't make sense. And sometimes it's accepting that those social norms don't make sense, and we just have to try to abide by it because it's the rules of our place that we work, or it's the rules of the place that we go to. And then other times you can challenge those social norms. But I have found that really breaking down those social norms into steps and breaking down what they mean is the most helpful in the conflicts with social norms. Next slide. Relationships and interpersonal. I dealt a lot with relationships, not only, you know, friends and family, but dating relationships as well. And I have found that communicating expectations is the most important thing when dealing with relationships in any type of situation, including dating. If you communicate your expectations from the get-go, you are going to have a much better relationship than if you just make assumptions. So really communicating your expectations every step of the way, especially in dating, you need to communicate those expectations and continuously do so. And then in establishing a new relationship with someone, you really need to see, after talking about your expectations, do your expectations match up? Because if they don't match up, it's probably not going to work out as a new relationship. You really need to have those expectations match up. And it might be difficult to start the conversation. Let's talk about expectations. But you can start the conversation pretty easily talking about simple things. Like, I really like it when we communicate every day. You know, talking and you know, just bringing it up and saying, I really like that we communicate every day. Is that something that you would also like to do? And if that person says, no, I want to communicate weekly, there may be an issue there. And then do you want to form that relationship? Relationship constructs change in various groups and cultures. You have to be cognizant of cultural differences and the group differences. One person may act very different in a group than they act one-on-one. And cultural you have to be aware and be open to learning about cultural differences, and things that go along with the cultural things. I think the best way to communicate that is to ask questions in a nice way, like, hey, I'd like to learn more about your culture. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? The most important thing in a dating relationship and in any relationship is getting consent for all steps of relationships. Consent is something that is something that we talk about and everyone talks about, but actually diving down into it can be a little intimidating. But just because it can be intimidating doesn't mean it shouldn't be talked about. I think consent for all steps and just asking, do you agree with this? Is this okay with you? And just because we have consent one time for something doesn't make the assumption you get consent for that same thing next time. So for example, you know, you had a kiss and it was nice. You should still ask to kiss that person next time, because you can't assume that they always want to kiss just because they kissed once. And crossing lines. Sometimes we cross lines and we need to be aware of that. And I think the most important thing in when you cross lines is to apologize and ask how you can do better next time, if you want to maintain that relationship. And next slide, I think that's it. Are there any questions you'd like to ask us?
Great. Thank you so much, Courtney and Liana. And that concludes the presentation portion and begins the Q&A session of today's webinar. Just as a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in your control panel. Because our time is limited, we may not be able to get to all the questions today. And if there are any questions that we do not get to, we will try to get back to you via email. So our first question that we have today is from Marcia, and the question is, I need examples of social norms that don't make sense and how to explain that to a neurodiverse person who disagrees with it.
Some examples of social norms that don't make sense. Here's an example of something. In our society, we say in the bedroom means sex. That is the social norm, that it's a thing that people say, and you say if you're in the bed, you're having fun in the bedroom, you're having sex. But in this example, I had a student that posted on social media, I had fun in the bedroom with you. And neurotypical people got very concerned about this post in social media. And I think the most important thing in situations like this is to not make those assumptions. Those things that we say that typically means something may not be understood. So really just having that conversation, hey, what did you mean by this? And if they say, you know, it was sex, then okay, we don't post that on social media. And you have a conversation about what you post on social media, and you have that conversation. If they mean something completely different, we played a board game and I had a lot of fun in the bedroom, but I didn't want to talk about the board game. Well, then you know, okay, there's this social norm example where when people say this phrase, it tends to mean this. That doesn't make any sense. I don't know why society has deemed this phrase means sexual intercourse, but that's what it means. So you have the conversation with them about how that saying might not make sense, but just because it doesn't make sense doesn't mean we should post that saying on social media.
Another example that I've run into in multiple ways is the idea of phrases like "in a sec," "in a minute," "I'll get to that quickly." That sometimes the literal soundingness of that statement, right, "in a second" or "in a minute," doesn't actually mean that amount of time. It is a way of sort of pushing the thing off, but making it kind of next in your queue. And so I try to be a little more direct in that language, but not everyone does, right? I'll say, I will be able to get to that next. I expect this problem I'm solving to take this amount of time. If I know the person is extremely literal, right? This may be about 20 minutes. Please check back in with me. But in other instances, I might be a little bit more vague, but time rounding versus phrases like, "oh, I'll get to it when I get to it," those can be really frustrating if we don't understand that that's sort of a brush off, right? Versus "in a sec" is "I'll get to that next, but I'm busy right now." And so being a little more direct, saying, I don't have the ability to solve that right now. Check back with me. And then giving a time frame can be very helpful, right? Give me a few minutes in someone's brain means 3 minutes, literally, right? And so they might come back in 3 and you expected them later in the afternoon.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you for your responses. Our next question is, how do you address communication about relationships or inappropriate behaviors for autistic persons?
For my work, it really just depends on the situation. Relationships look different for every couple and every friendship. So really, if it's inappropriate, if there's behaviors that are inappropriate, first talking to the person about their relationship and discussing, how it's going and everything, and then again talking about how it may not seem inappropriate, but again, these are things that we need to discuss and talk about. Society deems these inappropriate, and really just breaking it down step by step about why it's inappropriate, and giving them alternatives to their behaviors. For example, if you are, kissing in public and it just doesn't seem appropriate, well, that's something you do behind closed doors in a bedroom. If it's, wrestling, if they're, friends and they're wrestling, well, that's not something we do in public. So really just talking about it, breaking it down in steps, and then giving alternatives.
When it's direct between two people, one thing that I like to do is ask for consent before I engage in something that is physical or heavy emotionally, right? So for example, that doesn't just mean like, oh, it's going to make you sad or it's a traumatic story when I tell you. It could be I'm really excited about something that I just learned. I'm a bit of an info dumper and I love sci-fi. And so if a new series has come out, I've got certain people that I know are into that as well. I might text my friend Chris, for example, and say, hey, I just watched the whole season of this show. Do you have time for a dump? And she'll text back yes or no, or we'll schedule that time. And so even getting consent about, I'm very excited, or I've had a rough day, instead of just going right into it, you can ask for consent. And that shows that you respect the person's time, but it also means you're not going to end up with disappointed expectations because you were really excited to share this, or you needed help and that person wasn't ready for that emotional interaction that you wanted to engage in. And so I like to just help myself with, being disappointed by asking for that first. Do you have time for this? Did you watch this?
Okay, thank you so much for both of your responses. Appreciate it. Our next question is from Adam, and that question is, what advice would you give to someone looking to engage with the person that you are interested in?
Could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. What advice would you give to someone looking to engage with a person that they are interested in? And I'm wondering if that's like a romantic interest.
Before I give advice, I like to learn about the situation. So, I mean, each situation is unique, and I would say my advice is, talk with someone you trust about the situation. Talk to someone that's non-judgmental and really explain what's going on, and then ask that person that you trust for advice. Because there's not any relationship that's the same. So you can't really give a blanket statement for engaging with someone. But I think also with romantic relationships is, again, consent in every step of the way, getting consent to even just have that conversation. Hey, do you mind if we have a conversation? Hey, do you mind if we chat for a little while? You can start with consent at the first stage of a relationship, and then you're asking them if they have the time at that time to chat with you. And that's, I think, the first, and how you engage with a relationship is chatting and getting to know people. So asking some questions.
I agree. And I mean, even if I'm going to sit down at a table with somebody to eat lunch, if I'm in a work or a school situation, I always ask first, right? Do you mind if I sit down and have lunch with you? And that can be an easy way to get in, or to kind of start talking to somebody, interacting with them. If you have a shared interest or a shared space, right? You are in a class together, you go to the same comic book store, you see them in a coffee shop a lot, introducing yourself and talking about, seeing if they're interested in something. What I don't recommend is following them around and spying on them, right? And gathering intel and then going in and kind of telling them what you've learned about them, because that can be seen as intimidating. That can be very difficult, even though we might have noticed that they are also into Spider-Man comics and that they're always at the store on Tuesdays. Saying that to someone can be very intimidating and might make them a little concerned. You always want to start with just interacting on a pretty small basis, and just working from there.
Perfect. Thank you both for your responses. Our next question is from Kate, and the question is, it's a two-part question. How might one disclose a disability in a relationship? And how might one decide to even disclose in the first place?
Liana, if you don't mind, since I have a lot of experience with this. So I will disclose to all of you now that I have a hidden disability. I have something called ankylosing spondylitis. It impacts my physical abilities, but it isn't something that people always see about me. And it is hard for me to decide sometimes when to disclose that disability to someone. If it is a professional relationship, if it's not immediately impacting the relationship, I wait and feel it out a little bit. I try to get a sense of whether or not that person or that organization is open to it. But if it's going to impact me, if I need help or an accommodation, I disclose right away. Some organizations are very upfront about that, right? They have things in place and they're friendlier in that sense. With people, getting to know new people, I go back and forth. There's some people that are here today who I disclosed to immediately because I felt like they were someone I could trust. But there have been other instances where I waited to disclose my disability. Again, I always ask myself, and this is very personal, this is different for everyone, but I ask myself about safety. I ask myself about necessity, and then I also ask myself about trust. And that could take me 5 minutes, or it could take me 5 years. But it's really about, am I comfortable in that scenario? I will say that with autism, just from a research standpoint, that we find time and time again, disclosing that you are autistic to someone like an employer or a school counselor or an educator can improve outcomes, because it can shift someone's understanding of who you are, especially if you're very direct with, I do terrible with emails with like 6 or 7 questions in them, right? I need one question at a time, those sorts of things. That can make life easier. But in the situation of some things, right, like you may not disclose that you have asthma right away to somebody, where in the same token, you might tell them that you are allergic to bees, right? Or you have diabetes and you're at risk of, things happening in certain scenarios. It's really going to be by the person, and it's going to be about how comfortable you are in that situation. And that comfort is going to change and grow as you get to know that person better.
I also have an example. Personally, I have ADHD, and I hid it for a long time. And in my friendships, in my professional career, and in romantic relationships, I hid that from people. And once I started getting comfortable with the fact that, I do have a disability, but I still function and I'm still doing okay. Once I started to disclose, I had that sense that people understood me better. They understood my behaviors better. They understood, oh, why she jumps conversation so much. That's so annoying. Oh, she has ADHD. Maybe she's just jumping conversations because that's what her brain's doing. I found that in all realms, me disclosing, now only when I'm feeling safe and comfortable. I don't, scream it from the mountains. But when I feel safe and comfortable in a relationship or a workplace, I do disclose now. And I have found that my relationships have gotten stronger and better.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next question is from Katie, and the question is, what advice do you have when a person's efforts at friendship are unwanted or declined? For example, teens in the same class, one wants to be friends and is tried, and the other is not reciprocating or constantly refuses to talk or become friends.
Well, I would say most importantly, friendship's a choice for both people. Friendship is a choice. It is not a must. It is not a guarantee. Just because you like someone and you want to be friends with them, they still have the right to choose if they wanted to be friends with you or not, unfortunately. You could think they are the coolest person in the world, but they also have to choose to want to be friends with you. So my advice in that situation is, ask consent. Hey, do you mind chatting with me? Hey, would it be okay to sit with you? Would it be? And if you continuously get no, then that is something you should not pursue anymore, unfortunately, because it's a 50-50 and you can't have a one-sided friendship.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this happens a lot when we're teens, and I wouldn't take it personally, because sometimes that thing may have nothing to do with whether or not they are interested in being your friend. Maybe they're just overwhelmed with everything they have going on. Maybe their family is a little strange about who they're friends with. I have a niece who is a competitive cheerleader, and a lot of her friends are part of her competitive cheer group. And when she tries to branch out from that group, it's sometimes a struggle, not necessarily because of anything other than that takes up a lot of her time. And so it makes it hard sometimes when you've got competitions and practices and things like that to add people who are outside of that group in. And so she tries, and sometimes it fails. And we talk about that a lot because it hurts. You know, she's very friendly, wants to be friends with lots of people, but time constraints. And it's hard to say to somebody, you're not part of my cheer group, and so that makes it hard to be your friend, because she knows that's not kind to say. Necessarily, it might really hurt their feelings. It might make people feel like she only wants to be friends with cheerleaders. That's not the case. And so sometimes it's not you and it's not them. It's an external factor.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is from Nathan, and the question is, how can I help an autistic client who is prone to engaging with interpersonal conversations? For example, he's talking to himself in public spaces. It's not usually inappropriate, but it can be really awkward and confusing to those around him.
There are a few ways to deal with this. I have a friend who talks out loud to himself a lot, and he wears an AirPod. He used to wear a Bluetooth headset, and so it would look to other people as if he was having a conversation on the phone with someone other than talking to himself. Now, I have had several students who repeated things to themselves that they were trying to work them out. And sometimes that came with other like physical things like pacing, right? And if someone's alone in a classroom and they're pacing back and forth and saying the same thing over and over to themselves, a bystander might find that stressful or not understand it. Or if, say, you were doing it in a Walmart or in a grocery store, right? You couldn't make a decision and you were saying the same thing and pacing back and forth, pacing, that might make people feel uncomfortable. And so I would say, depending on the level, there are different ways to deal with this to help both your client be comfortable, but also to think about those social norms. You know, is it going to put your client in danger that they do this? It sounds like maybe not. And so maybe just something like a turned off Bluetooth that looks like they have a phone attached to their head might help reduce that stress for everyone involved, so that they can continue to do that if it helps them, while other people may just think they're on the phone.
Great, thank you so much, Courtney. Our next question is, how do you handle consent issues when there are power issues involved, for example, with a boss or an educator?
I guess I would want more clarification, but consent is necessary in those situations as well. And if you don't feel safe or that your boundaries are being, overstepped, I think that it should be reported through the proper channels. So I don't think anyone should ever feel unsafe with a boss or a professor or a teacher, and if that's not the case, following the proper channels and reporting that, and also confiding in someone you trust, because that has a lot of emotional stuff that goes along with when your boundaries are being overstepped.
Yeah, I agree. This is what HR departments are really good for, or counseling centers at your school, or guidance counselors, I think they're still called in the high school level. Just making sure that someone is aware of what's going on, and also think about not only like that reporting structure, but also what are your systems that you have if you're not sure what's happening, right? If you're like, this seems inappropriate, do you have someone you can talk to who's reliable to help you figure that out, right? To kind of talk through the scenario. Sometimes we think something is appropriate and it isn't, right? We talked about those social norms, and then vice versa. Sometimes we're like, is this appropriate? And culturally it may be, but we don't totally understand what's being asked. And so we may need to go back and get clarification from the person. And I do this sometimes, right? If somebody gives me a lot of information, I will say, can I repeat that back so I made sure I understood what you're asking of me? And sometimes in that process, I might discover that I didn't hear something correctly. Not that my listening maybe wasn't right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your response. I think we have time for one more question here, and the question is, how do you understand communication needs on a less verbal person?
It just depends on that person and how they communicate. And there's ways of communicating that are nonverbal. There's pictures, there's communication boards, there's pointing, there's so finding a way to communicate at that person's level, I think, is most important. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to find that, but never really giving up and always pursuing a way for that person to express their wants and needs, and doing your best to making that happen, I think is what you need to do.
Yeah, I've had several experiences where nonverbal meant very different things, meaning that I had students who were using ASL primarily, but other students that were autistic, nonverbal or low verbal. And there are, hopefully in situations, in these situations, there are ways for you to work that out with that person or with a third party. Sometimes people have someone that helps them establish those communication approaches. I had a student who I'm still friends with who primarily uses ASL, but actually loves memes and GIFs as a way to communicate. And so we do that a lot, a lot of my interactions with him are just, really funny memes, and occasionally a little bit of text. It's not that he can't, formulate full sentences to talk with me. It's that he knows that he can communicate this way with me, and it works, and it's how he wants to communicate. Now, it took about a year for us to get from we're texting each other to I prefer memes. Again, we talked about disclosing and comfort and things like that. It took him a while to get to that level where he's like, I trust you enough that I can send memes about hot rods and D&D, and you're going to get it. And that's about becoming closer and understanding each other better. It's a very professional relationship, it's a mentor relationship, but it's still one that's got a lot of memes flying around about, cars and things. And so that can be a case. But I've also had students where, eye contact and verbalization were very, very difficult. And so, depending on what their comfort level was and their level in other skill areas, I worked with that, Sometimes we would just sit across from each other with laptops, firing emails at each other in the same room, or, using image boards to work through some things. And so there are people out there who can be helpful and want to be helpful and want to communicate and build those relationships, even if you're not the best speaker or best at nonverbal communication.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, that is all the time that we have today for questions. So thank you so much, Courtney and Liana, and thank you everyone for joining us today. If you found today's event helpful, we encourage you to let us know in our survey. Once you close out of today's event, you will receive an exit survey, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. Everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to today's video recording and materials within the week. On behalf of the Organization for Autism Research, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day. And as this is the last webinar in our series on sexuality and relationships, the Organization for Autism Research says thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone.